If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
A year after the Michael Brown shooting, St. Louis's political leadership is reflecting on what happened and looking to the future. One of these people is St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCulloch, a man who is at the center of the Brown saga. He joins us next on a special edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair to say.
Hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio is
fellow reporter Joe Mannies.
And our very special guest today,
Bob McCulloch.
Don't worry, I call every guest very special. So I'm not just sucking up to you before we ask you super hard questions. Thank you so much for coming here.
Yeah, this is the St. Louis County Prosecutor since 1991, correct?
January 1, yes.
And we're going to be talking a little bit retrospectively about the Michael Brown saga, but also looking forward about policies that are emanating from it. But, we're not going to change the format just because you're very special. We want to know a little bit about you, how you got into politics, where you were born, where you went to high school.
Which is my favorite question.
All that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Okay, so first, tell us a little bit about yourself and, yes, where you went to high school and how you got into politics.
Well, I was born and dragged up in St. Louis. I don't think I've ever left St. Louis. I guess first lived on Wabada, and then right off of Goodfellow, and then some years later moved to, I always say Pine Lawn, but we actually lived in the city. The city had that, I usually say goofy, but I won't say that this time, residency rule for police officers at the time. And so we lived in the city about 2 doors from the county.
Yeah, because your father was a police officer.
Correct.
So you lived in North St. Louis City, is that
right.
correct?
Oh, yeah, grew up, right at Goodfellow and Highway 70, although when we moved there, it was Goodfellow and there was no Highway 70. So, and then I went to school, St. Paul the Apostle in Pine Lawn. I went to Augustinian Academy in South St. Louis, and then to St. Louis University, undergraduate and law school.
Yeah.
And so when did you graduate from law school?
I graduated in law school in 1977.
And so then what did you do then?
I went to work. I wanted to, I'd applied at couple different prosecutors' offices, the city and the county, but I was fortunate enough to be offered a job as a clerk for Judge Stewart, Joe Stewart, on the Court of Appeals.
Really?
Yeah, and that was something nobody would pass up. So I did that, and that was a great experience. It was a 1-year clerkship, and then the judge knew going in that I was looking to be a prosecutor. So. Probably in the springtime of '78, said, "Fine, if you want to start looking, go right ahead." And things worked out that I got hired by St. Louis County, not the city, but I interviewed with the city and the county. The county hired me in the spring of 1978, and so I started there, and I was an assistant prosecutor in the county until 1985. I remember Courtney Goodman was the prosecutor at the time, and then Buzz Westfall was elected in '78, took office in '79. And Buzz and I became, it was like with everybody else in the office, very good friends.
Seems like everybody was friends with Buzz Westfall.
He was a very friendly guy.
He was great.
He was, and knew what he was doing, too. We didn't realize how much of a mess that office was until Buzz came in, and you could kind of see that, well, this is how it can actually work.
Yeah.
So... and I worked there for, long as I could. We got my wife and I married in '78 and had 4 children eventually. And but as the kids were coming, the expenses were going up, and you just couldn't afford to be an assistant prosecutor. Even though I'd been there a little over 7 years, trying some major cases, a lot of big cases, a lot of murder cases and the like. But you just couldn't afford to do it, and it killed me. But we had to make the choice to leave. So I left in 1985, and went to work for a terrific firm, Lartz, Blunkert and Bruning. I'll give them a plug.
Okay.
Do they still exist?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Well, then they're going to get like either tons of business or they're going to go out of business when you say that.
Well, actually, it started off something different. Speaking of going out of business, and did blow up.
Okay.
But coming out of that firm with Larratt's, Plunkett, and Bruning, and that they're great people, and a terrific firm. So I worked for them, and they worked there 85 until I got elected and took office, and so I took office on January 1, 1991. It's the election, a primary election in August of 90, and then the general election in November of 90.
Now, that was an interesting election, just from the standpoint that you and the Republican Rick Grunder both had experiences from, I mean, you were the son of a policeman. He had a violent encounter when he was a young man.
Well, that was the 94 election.
Okay.
In 90, it was very interesting because it was an open seat. Buzz had decided
to run for county
executive, and I had no intention of ever being involved in politics. But I saw that was an opportunity to come back into the prosecutor's office, and so I, and along with an awful lot of other people, saw that same opportunity. So at one point, there were probably 8 or 10 people making the rounds, running for the office. Ultimately, we ended up with 2 Democrats in the primary, 2 Republicans in the primary, and all four of us had been employed by the prosecutor's office. 3 of us at the same time. Rick Berry and I ran against each other in the primary, and we had been assistants together. And then in the general election, Tom Meehan,
That's right.
and I ran against each other, and we had been not just assistants together, but roommates in the office, office mates. So it was a pretty interesting race, long,
but I think that was one of your tougher races, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there was no doubt about it. That went on for really a long time. I mean, I started really campaigning and slowly, but worked into it. But that would have been January of, late December really of 1988, and then it went until November really of 1990. So it was a long, long time.
Yeah,
everyone lose an awful lot of weight getting the campaign.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was, I think, 6 or 7 years old when you were first elected. So really
you still voted for me, though, right?
From suburban Chicago. But from reading about you and just from talking with Joe, it seems like there were 2 things that happened before you were elected, I think, that probably greatly impacted you. One was your father being shot in the line of duty. And the other, I think, was a childhood cancer diagnosis that took your leg. So how did those 2 things affect you going forward, not only in your life, but in your public career?
Well, not surprisingly, like a lot of kids growing up, you look to your father. And the example they set. My father was a police officer, and so I just kind of assumed everybody's father is a police officer, and so we were always around police, and we saw what went on, and read stories that were in the newspaper, and it was just sort of that, a lot of lawyers have lawyers for kids. A lot of doctors have doctors for kids, and Teamsters have Teamsters for kids, and on down the line. So it just seemed a natural. I mean, I just sort of thought, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be a policeman too. Then, yes, when I was in high school, I had bone cancer and lost a leg, which obviously meant I was not going to be a police officer.
Did you want to be a police officer before that happened? Because I remember reading U.S. Representative Ike Skelton's book about how he wanted to go into the military before he got polio, and obviously he couldn't do that anymore. Was that your career goal before?
Yeah, it was. You talked to everybody at that time. I graduated high school in '69, so just about everybody I knew talked at one point or other about the military. Because that was a pretty hot time for the military and going in or not going in. And so there was always talk about, well, go in. And then when you get out of the military, join the police department, because you couldn't do it till you were 21 anyway. And so that obviously changed when I was 17, which is when, and actually before that, because I had some issues with my knee before that, which were pretty much going to knock all that out. And so then, it was a career change. I thought, well, there's nothing wrong with being a lawyer. I'll be a lawyer. And then I thought, well, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'll be a prosecutor.
Right. Although there are some people who don't like lawyers or prosecutors, but they're losers.
I have 2 of them. Both of my kids are
Joe
lawyers.
is not one of them. But I think
you don't like lawyers until you need one.
I think that to get a little bit into Ferguson, but also to stay in your background, I think that why there were some people that wanted you to recuse yourself from the Michael Brown situation was the fact that your father was shot by a police officer. And I think that was probably an argument like in the 2000s with the Jack in the Box case as well.
It was.
Like, how did you kind of respond to the line of argumentation that you should have been out of that because of the personal experience that you had?
You know, we're all shaped by our life experiences, and that certainly was one to me. But when I looked at it, and the way I've described it before is, you know, it wasn't in July of 1964, as far as I was concerned, it wasn't a police officer who was killed in the line of duty. It was my father who was killed. Whether he was a police officer or not was not the true trauma. The true trauma was that he was my father and he wasn't coming home anymore. So, you know, and so in that regard, it's no different than anybody else. The circumstances, and dying a violent death as he did, whatever the circumstances happen to be. So, the criticism that has been leveled over the years made a pretty big jump from your father was a police officer who was killed in the line of duty, therefore you can't be fair when it comes to a police officer. And there's just no logic in between the two. There's never anybody said, well, here, take a look at this, and here's why. This is why you're not fair. Look at look at this, and this, and shows you're not fair.
It was all stemming from your father's death.
Yeah, it was just one thing jumped 50 years forward to the next thing.
Yeah.
And it was just, you know, there was just, and it's hard to counter that to say, well, no, it doesn't. Well, yeah, it does, you know, because you couldn't do that. And it was a black man who killed your father, and therefore you can't be fair to black men. Well, that's just, it's not logical.
Yeah, but I think this experience has kind of prompted a public policy discussion about whether prosecutors should step aside when there's police involved, shootings or killings. I want to play a clip from Representative Joshua Peters, who's a Democrat from St. Louis, basically making the argumentation that it should happen.
I would like to see an independent attorney appointed by the prosecutors in police shootings. I think that's something that's manageable. It's something that's reasonable. And I think that's going to be a big issue with whoever runs for circuit attorney to replace Jennifer Joyce, where they stand on that issue.
Obviously, the circuit attorneys in St. Louis City, that race is going to be open. But it's not only Democrats who have been calling for that. I think State Representative Jay Barnes of Jefferson City has said that's a good idea as well. Right. What's your thoughts on that proposal?
Well, the thought is that, and everybody's always willing, or at least we are, look at various options and proposals put forward. But when you look at appointing a special prosecutor, again, it's the mere fact that you're saying it's not too dissimilar from saying your father was killed as a police officer, therefore you can't be fair. You're a prosecutor, therefore you can't be fair. And so there's just no logic behind that. When you look at the proposals that are out there, and every one that I've seen, I've looked at all of them. One is that you appoint the prosecutor in an adjoining county. And let me back up a little bit. The reason put forth by everybody is you work too closely with the police in order to be fair when it comes to the police. And again, there's nothing to back that up, and everything that is out there doesn't back that up. You know, in my office alone, over the past 24 years that I've been there, you know, we've prosecuted probably 50 police officers or more, and for everything from murder, but that was not police related. It was on duty, but it's a long story. It had nothing to do with this police work. It was a family dispute, but a lot of things on duty, from child molestation to sexual assault to burglary and stealing and you name it. So and even assaults of suspects that were coming up. Now, never an officer involved death of a suspect. But that's actually a good thing, because we looked at every one. We looked at those for the past 20 years, and there just hasn't been one. It's not to say everything was done properly, but that it was an appropriate use of force, a necessary use of force. So some of the proposals are then when you have that too close of a relationship to be fair. And so one proposal was, well, let's appoint the prosecutor in an adjoining county. Well, if you look at the city of St. Louis, I'm the only prosecutor who adjoins the city of St. Louis. So when that was pointed out, it was like, well, okay, that's not what we want, because we don't want you handling all those.
Yeah. So in other words, they don't want. It's not just not handling St. Louis cases. That part of the effort is so that you wouldn't handle any cases.
Correct. Well, so you wouldn't handle any police shootings.
Right.
So then who's going to handle those? Then it was pointed out, well, we'll make the attorney general automatically the special prosecutor. Well, First of all, the Attorney General's not on the ground right then and there. So what are they going to do? And what do you do until the Attorney General in that situation could get there and start the investigation, the prosecution? So who's going to do that? Well, the same people who are doing it now. The police are going to do it, or you just sit there and wait until they show up, which is not a particularly effective way to conduct an investigation. The other is, when you look at the Attorney General currently, the Attorney General's office has a prosecution office that's about half the size of mine. They've got about 25 prosecutors in there who crisscross the state of Missouri prosecuting cases, which means necessarily they work very closely with law enforcement throughout the state of Missouri, in particular the Highway Patrol. Mm-hmm. So if that criticism is there that you're working too closely with the police, it applies to the Attorney General's office also. In addition to that, the current Attorney General was the elected prosecutor for 10 years in Cass County. Yeah. And the other thing I pointed out is what happens if I get elected Attorney General next year? Then I'm in charge of everything in the state.
I take it that you're swearing that off right here and now.
I never swear on or off anything.
I wanted to make national news here.
So it's all those things. And then it's like, well, so who are you going to appoint? And who's going to be, who's responsible for that? What resources are there? You know, the investigations cost money. So are there new investigators coming in? And are they going to be law enforcement? Well, if they're law enforcement, they have that same bias. So the whole idea is just rife with flaws in it, and no one's ever addressed that. And the bottom line is this: we elect prosecutors in the state of Missouri, and we elect them to do the job, and that includes investigating and prosecuting every case that should be prosecuted within that jurisdiction. And if you don't trust the prosecutor to do that, then don't elect them, or throw them out at the next election when it comes. If you can't trust the prosecutor, your elected officials, throw them out.
Now, veering to the Michael Brown case, you and I talked about this a few days ago when you'd participated in the questionnaire that we did of a number of elected officials. What made this case different from some of the other cases that you've handled, and why do you think it became so emotional, became an international issue?
I think what made it different was the extent of the media coverage, beginning with social media, and that just didn't exist in prior cases and prior situations. The same argument, if you want to go back to the 2000 shooting, the Jack in the Box, the same arguments, the same issues were raised in that, but and even a lot of the same participants were involved, in the demonstrations. And so, but you didn't have the social media, and then the 24-hour news cycle didn't pick up on it and run with that. And so that was the biggest part. And so social media.
How did social media?
Well, social media, if you recall, within, I'm going to say half an hour, and that's probably pretty generous, there were a half dozen or more reports on social media as to what had happened. And most of them were that Mr. Brown was on his knees with his hands up asking not to be shot, and the officer walked up and shot him. And at that point, nobody in law enforcement or anywhere else knew how many times Mr. Brown had been shot, much less where he had been shot or the circumstances surrounding it. And so that went out, and that became gospel, because if you hear it 3 times, it becomes the truth, no matter what it is. And so it was not possible to counter that for a number of hours, at least until somebody could see how many times and start an investigation and do that. And because of the circumstances on the scene at that time, that investigation couldn't get started in earnest for quite some time. Mm-hmm. By then, it was around the social media world with that. Now, it took several days for the news cycles and the like, the cable news people to pick up on it and run with it. But then they just started broadcasting the same sort of thing, saying, here it is.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons you became one of the central figures in this entire situation is you decided to convene a grand jury instead of deciding for yourself whether Darren Wilson should have been prosecuted for anything. Sure. Comparably, the Baltimore city attorney didn't have a grand jury. She decided on her own to indict the police officers, and it prolonged the story, in my opinion, much longer because of that grand jury process. Do you think that had an effect on why, it got more coverage because the grand jury process was longer than that?
I don't think so because of this. There are two ways primarily for cases to get filed, assuming there's sufficient evidence in order to file a charge. We'll assume that for the second. There are two ways to do it. One is to wait until the investigation is completed by law enforcement. You can't make a decision until you have the information. And that was going to take 3 or 4 months or longer in order to gather that information. Because there were so many people that had to be interviewed. There were so many statements out there by all these people, different people, on opposite ends of the spectrum where the statements were. And then there's all the physical evidence on top of that, in addition to 3 separate postmortem examinations and a parallel federal investigation that was ongoing. And by the way, the local FBI and U.S. Attorney were great in all that, because whatever information they got, they immediately provided to us. Whatever information we were obtained, we immediately provided to them. So even though they're parallel investigations, we all had the same information. But that took months. So the options were wait until that investigation is completed by law enforcement, and then sit down with them and go through all the evidence and see what needs to be done, if anything, and then present the matter to a grand jury or make the determination as to whether we go ahead and file charges and then present it to a grand jury. Or what I ultimately decided to do was start immediately with the investigation. The grand jury has the authority to investigate, not just indict, but to investigate. And so that was what we were doing with that. So in effect, there were 3 investigations ongoing: the grand jury, the county police, and the federal investigation.
Yeah. But one of the criticisms of the grand jury process, and maybe you can just address it here, and I'm sure you've addressed it before, is that the critics say that you provided so much information and put so many people in front of the grand jury that it just overwhelmed them with so much information that they couldn't render a proper decision. What do you say to criticism like that?
I say it's dumbfounding to me how I could be criticized for providing all the information available to the finder of fact. If you look at how a trial is operated, a trial where a jury is going to decide if the individual is guilty or not guilty, that is exactly how the information comes in. All the information that is available goes to that jury, and then that jury goes into the back room and deliberates and decides, is he guilty or not guilty of this offense? That's how every trial works. And so all of the evidence that we put in front of the grand jury is evidence that would have been admissible at a trial. And that's an obligation I have. And that includes evidence that may mitigate the level of the offense or may just show that no crime was committed. I've got that obligation because the grand jury is a one-sided affair. There is no defense attorney in there. There's no judge in there. And so I have an obligation set out by the rules of how prosecutors conduct business, reinforced by the National District Attorneys Association's procedures, the ABA's procedures, saying I have an obligation to present even exculpatory evidence to the grand jury. So we put all of that evidence in. And I've said before, if I overwhelmed and confused this grand jury, then I also overwhelmed and confused the entire United States Department of Justice because they had exactly what that grand jury had.
And they didn't indict Officer Wilson either.
Correct.
So.
And not only didn't indict him, but stated unequivocally that his use of force, they're not saying that everything was done right procedurally in terms of, how maybe it could have been avoided, maybe it couldn't, all that, but said when it came down to the use of force in self-defense that it was an appropriate or a proper use of force.
Yeah.
So, is there anything looking back that you would have done differently? Either substantive or not?
Yeah. We look at it all the time. We have been for the last year, and we will be for years to come. And kind of the conclusion I've come to is that there are ways that it could have been done differently, than what we did in some regards. But I don't know that it just doesn't make them better or worse, but they could have been done differently.
Like, would you have still announced the decision at night? Like, that was
Sure.
a heavily criticized decision.
It was. And that's a good example. Let me do that. In looking at that, we could have tried to hold off and said on Monday night, we're going to announce this tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. All right, and then that way people had overnight and everything else. But the more we looked at it, and that was one way of doing it, but the more we looked at it, we thought everything was in place. The word was out that, yes, the grand jury has reached a decision, and I thought ultimately that it was the best way to do it. There's no good time to do it, but the best time to do it was as quickly as possible so that the word is out there, we can release the information, and people can start looking at that. By doing it at 8 o'clock, and 8 o'clock was the time that we needed to get everything ready through the media. The local media stations were great with all that, but trying to get that much time ready. The police were already in place. They were already on high alert and on their 12-hour shifts and in position where the National Guard was. They were around. But the schools were closed. The schools had already announced.
Was that one of the reasons you did it at night?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, we wanted to do it after, of course, the schools were closed and the students had enough time to get home. Mm-hmm. That businesses had an opportunity to close and make their determination they're going to be open or closed tomorrow. That rush hour traffic, to the extent we have rush hour traffic around here, I've been in Chicago recently, that was over and done with, that people weren't going to get caught in a situation where something kicks up on the street.
Because did you expect that to be the response of the decision, like rioting and looting and burn down buildings?
Yes. We expected, and I expected, that there would be a violent reaction to it. What I didn't know and couldn't anticipate was the extent of it. I didn't know if there'd be a lot, there'd be a little. I didn't think, and I don't think anyone did, thought it would be widespread. And when widespread, I mean beyond pretty much the area where it was, out West Florissant, and then in front on New Florissant, in front of the police station, City Hall.
Yeah.
As opposed all over the metropolitan area. So we didn't think that was going to occur.
Now, was there anything that had you expected to see more National Guard troops or anything like that on the ground after this? Or
yeah, let me back up a little bit. You have to keep in mind that we being the prosecutor's office and the investigators on the case, not just my investigators, but the FBI, the county police officers who were involved directly in the investigation, were all working our end of it, and not working the security and
right. That was the governor's
control.
Role because he controls.
Well, for the National Guard, certainly was the governor's control, and he had declared, I believe, a state of emergency, which put him in charge of everything. So we just kind of assumed those were being handled the way they should be. And I know I saw the governor say that the National Guard will be here and they will not tolerate burning, looting, stealing. Those aren't his exact words, but
well, that's a question
close.
I guess we have for the governor if he ever comes on the show.
Yeah. So now since then, of course, that particular case is over. Now you have mentioned, though, there is at least one legal case that's still pending that's related
Correct.
to the Michael Brown shooting. You
Correct.
want to mention that?
That case is the one filed by the juror Doe, the anonymous juror who wants to be able to avoid the oath that was taken and be able to talk about certain things.
Now, looking ahead, and you and I talked about this before, what do you hope comes out of this, and what do you think could come out of this?
What I hope comes out of it, and I don't think I've said it yet, but I've said it many times before, this is still a horrible, tragic death, regardless of the circumstances. Michael Brown was a young man who lost his life, and that's always a terrible thing, regardless of the circumstances. And it had, of course, devastating effect on the officer that was involved. And no young man should ever be shot and killed by the police, and no police officer should ever be put in that position. But we know that's going to happen. And so one good thing about it is training has been reemphasized with law enforcement and they've always done a pretty good job with that in how to deal with people for years. Since the mental health system in the country was dismantled in the 80s, the police have become the street corner psychiatrists who have to deal with the mentally ill. And so a lot of training has gone into that. And so now it's spread to just to a general sort of de-escalating a situation. And the other, as I think the community understands now too, that they have to be much more involved. They can't sit back and complain about crime in the neighborhood and then ignore it, and then not get involved, not assist the law enforcement in addressing that crime. They know better than anybody who the bad guys in the neighborhood are, and yeah, they've got to get involved. There are ways to do it, with, of course, protecting people and protecting their and maintaining their safety. The other, I think, is finally there's that political will developing to address the municipal situation. We have municipalities that are just, they're not capable of providing, my biggest concern is they're not capable of providing effective law enforcement to their citizens. And by that I mean they don't have the resources to put an appropriate number of well-trained, experienced police officers on the street. Some of the areas that have the least amount of resources have the highest crime rate and need good law enforcement more than anybody else. But regardless of where you live in St. Louis County, everybody's entitled to have good, effective, responsible, well-trained, well-funded law enforcement. And there are far too many communities that can't do that. And they've got to sit down and come to the realization that they can't do it, and so they need to do something about it.
Do you envision more small communities basically contracting out to St. Louis County because of now within 6 years they're going to have certified police department?
Correct.
Or do you expect that this could lead to many of the smaller communities either dissolving or merging?
I think we'll see some. I hope we will see some of both. But you have to be very careful. There's a move now for a number of smaller communities to band together and provide police service for the whole area. On paper, that's a good idea, but again, it's the resources. So if you have 10 municipalities, each with a police department, and 5 of them are underfunded and can't do it, you can't put them with 5 people who have adequate funding and expect that now you're going to be able to do adequate funding for everybody. It's just not going to work. The economics don't work. Yeah. And so we're seeing some of that, and that's going to be a problem. We have to make sure that we can avoid doing that. So I do expect and hope that a lot of municipalities, going straight out Natural Bridge to start with, will look at the county and consider and contract, not just consider it, but contract with St. Louis County to provide that service. You get a great police department, a nationally and internationally accredited department, and a full service department, so that when you have a major crime in that municipality, you don't have to then call county in. You can contract with a neighboring department or one that's 3 munis away, but if you have a murder, a sexual assault, you need some specific evidence gathered and the like, they're still going to call county police in. And so by contracting with county, there's the economy of scale. Yeah. Yep. And you get a great police department.
Now, since this is politically speaking, I do want to ask about the political kind of ramifications surrounding the Michael Brown shooting. What some national media people may not have grasped is August 9th came after a very contentious primary between Steve Stenger and Charlie Dooley.
Sure. You got involved.
You cut ads for Steve Stenger. I would say that some people, even Charlie Dooley, even said that decision may have been a key factor in the election. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if the reaction to the Michael Brown shooting, especially the negative portrayals of you by some of the people that may have been upset by the decision, had any role in, how you were kind of talked about by some people and how you were criticized.
I think with some that it did, yes. And those were some political people and not political people, or non-office holders who supported Charlie. Who were not happy that not only I, but a number of other people and organizations switched from supporting Charlie to supporting Steve Stenger for county executive. They were upset about that, and I think in some cases it was an opportunity for someone to be very vocal about it, not come right out and say it's because McCulloch supported Stenger instead of Dooley, but just kind of went off on me on a variety of occasions.
And here's actually a clip of Charlie Dooley saying some not so nice things about you, which may be an example.
That's why Bob McCulloch did what he did. He understands this community, and you know what I'm talking about. I had to say it. I said it was a race card. He pulled a race card. Charlie Dooley. Here I am, the highest elected official in the county, and you're gonna call me corrupt. A sitting attorney would say that. prosecuting attorney would say that, knowing it's not true, and to say he outright lied.
Well, I talked with some African American officials after that, what I would say comments, and what they pointed to is the fact that when you call an African American official corrupt, or in your case, corruption was rampant or something. I don't think you called Charlie Dooley corrupt directly.
No, I didn't.
But it has an extra stinging effect compared to if you do that to a white politician. I'd like you to respond to that and to that entire argumentation.
Well, I don't know. I mean, calling a activity or actions corrupt should have the same effect and impact on anybody, whether you're African American or a white guy. I don't know why it would be held in any greater regard, I guess, for depending upon the race of the individual involved. What I was talking about in those ads, and I was very careful about that, is that corruption is not just criminal conduct, but it's unethical conduct. And if you look back at the ads that were on there and what we were talking about, those were things that involved conflicts of interest and really just bad decisions that were being made, not by Charlie, but by others in his administration. But if you're at the top, then you bear the brunt of it. And it's not like nobody ever talked to Charlie and said, these guys are killing you. Temporiti and Mike Jones and Gary Earls were killing him.
Yeah, and it's possible he would have lost regardless of those ads because of the park situation.
Sure.
But I did hear that from some people that there's an extra layer of sensitivity on that. But I think it jumps to a broader question because post-Ferguson, I think, as you kind of mentioned, there's a greater examination of municipalities and law enforcement, as you mentioned. But I'm just wondering, as the countywide prosecutor, how do you feel your relationship is with the African American community, and what do you plan to do going forward to forge trust with them?
I will be I have said this before. I have intentionally sat back for a number of reasons. One, I never said anything to anybody about Ferguson until well after, pretty much even after the grand jury announcement, certainly, and then even some time past there, just to kind of let emotions and feelings calm down. Because my concern was if I came out and said something, I didn't want anybody to have a reason to go out and do something stupid. And so, so there was some backlash when I did talk about some things, but I think it could have been worse as it went on. Then there were a number of lawsuits that were involved, and I was just not in a position to be able to go out and talk about a lot of things until then. But, I think, we have to reach out to the entire community, including, obviously, the African-American community, and sit back. We could have always, and I could have always done a better job of educating the public on exactly what we do. And that is one thing that I learned. And I talk about the grand jury. I know exactly what I'm talking about, but most people have no idea where a grand jury comes from or what their responsibility is or what they're there to do.
It's interesting, just not to interrupt, but I was reading some archives of when you first ran for office, and one of your goals was actually increasing minority attorneys in the prosecuting office.
Right.
So that was like one of your goals early on. So it must have been jarring for you to be nationally caricatured as racially insensitive during this entire thing, when at the very beginning of your career, it was a goal to diversify the office. Was that something that crossed your mind at all?
It was. I was asked several times, well, how many African-American lawyers do you have? And, at the time it was 5 or 6 attorneys in there. I'd say, well, that's not even 10%, so shame on you. I said, well, wait a minute. First of all, in the entire nation, less than 5% of attorneys, regardless of what kind of law they practice, are African-American attorneys. And when you look, I mean, we have gone out over the years, and for a long time, I know when we'd have an opening, county would send a notice to the Mountain City Bar Association looking. So, so we've done what we can to increase the participation. I think it's very important, of course, because there are times when a young African American kid may be much more comfortable talking to a young African American lawyer, just as a young child female may be more comfortable talking to a female lawyer. I mean, call that what you want, but it makes perfect sense, and we need those bodies. So we've done that, and as I said, I've been criticized in some aspects or some part of the African American community, but I think I still have a lot of support there. I mean, it's not uncommon for African Americans and white guys too to stop me on the street and say, hey, fine, we think you're doing a fine job, and you did this, and we try to run all these cases the way they should be, prosecute them, and not prosecute cases that shouldn't be prosecuted, regardless of the racial makeup of the individuals involved.
One of the things that intrigued me, and this is something for our listeners too, is that before the Michael Brown situation, on a political level, whether one likes it or not, you were probably one of the most popular Democrats in the St. Louis area. You've really not had a major opponent, and many times no Republican opponent, for most of the last 20 years. When Buzz Westfall tragically died in 2003, there would have been some pressure on you to consider running to fill out the rest of his term. There was also pressure on you that same time in 2004 to consider running for Congress because Dick Gephardt was stepping down. And so there had been a lot of pressure on you over the years to go to a different office. You have never done that. Has this experience changed? I mean, I guess when looking back over your political decisions, do you have any regrets about that, considering what's happened? And B, what are your future plans?
Yeah, I knew there was a B coming. I have no regrets over the years of not running for some other office, and I looked at each and every one, as it would come in, and just even the most recent county executive election, there were a lot of people saying, "Why
Correct.
don't you run for?" And so I looked at all those and just made a conscious decision, a very informed decision, not to do that. Whether it was Congress, I will tell you this: that since the Michael Brown situation, I've been approached about running for a lot of other offices too. And so you look at all those things and make a determination, whether it's attorney general or governor for that matter. And so you look at all those things, and you never say never, but you always look at them.
So are you going to make some news here?
I find it
Probably
hard to
not.
believe you're going to run against Chris Koster, given that you endorsed him in 2008 when a lot of other people weren't endorsing him. If that's a fair assessment.
Well,
are you going to endorse anybody in the attorney general's race, though?
I said we've been kind of busy getting everything in order and in line, and there's plenty of time to sit back and go.
Well,
so
we'll
sure.
have to see. And
Yeah,
We'll have to
because
see who's running. Everybody running for attorney general.
yeah,
too.
I mean, without one of the interesting things, although you did run into a lot of controversy over endorsing Stanger, in fact, that sort of fits a pattern of yours. I mean, you endorsed Claire McCaskill when she ran against Bob Holden, who was the sitting governor.
Correct.
About 10 years ago. And you have, as Jason mentioned, you endorsed Chris Koster in that really nasty three-way Democratic primary in 2008 for attorney general. So I'm sure there are some politicians who have either asked for your endorsement for 2016 or maybe have decided not to because of the Michael Brown situation. And when you're talking to people on a political level, has there been some discussion about that?
There really hasn't been. I think, and I really do think. I mean, the political junkies are the ones who are thinking about the governor's race next year.
Like us.
Yes, right, like you. Nobody else is thinking about it, and so I think as time goes on, then people will sit down and start talking about it. Who's going to run, what's going to happen, who's going to do what, and where you're going to go. I've never been afraid of stepping up and endorsing somebody and supporting somebody. I think it would be good for the office, regardless of what else is going on in that. I'm not one who said no, you can't run against a fellow Democrat. You can't run for So I did that. So when Claire McCaskill ran, I'd do whatever I could do to get Claire McCaskill to run for governor now. So I would love to see her. She'd make a good president. She'd make a better governor. So
Wow.
But and I would say this too, and let me go back to Charlie Dooley. I don't want to leave this part out. I worked hard for Charlie Dooley when he was going, and Charlie did a great job for the first 5 or 6 years. I made a commercial for him. There are a lot of people all over me to run for county executive.
And I even asked him at the time, it's like, you're saying all these bad things about McCulloch now, but you weren't saying that when he was endorsing you. So it begs the question, why not then and opposed to now? But again, we don't want to dredge up too much history.
And I think just the emotion. Charlie's a wonderful guy and did a great job, and unfortunately had some issues with the people surrounding him that cost him an awful lot.
Yeah.
And that's
now looking at 2018. That's when this current term you're in expires. Have you given any thoughts to that?
You knew that was coming.
Yeah, I know. But it's like every term I've been very fortunate that the voters have returned me to that office every 4 years, and every halfway through those terms, I start looking at it again, decide, I've done this now. This is my 25th year, and I've been very fortunate to have the trust of the electorate in St. Louis County, and I hope that certainly will continue. I think it does, but we'll always wait and see.
We will see.
28 years old.
We'll have to have you on again in 2018. Thank you so much
hope
for.
You have to before then.
We'll have to have you on before then. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
You can find all of our stories at stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. You can follow Joe on Twitter at
@JMannies. That's JMannies.
And I'm going to take a wild guess that you're not on Twitter, so people can send a stork with messages in it to send you any messages.
That's correct. I'm not on Twitter.
Okay.
Or Facebook. Or whatever else there is out there.
A lot of stuff, too much stuff. We'll be back next week. Until then, so long.
I'm coming home to make it all right, so dry your eyes. We think the same things at the same time. We just can't do anything about it.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.